every time I visit the US, I feel like the food is making me sick for no reason. And when I come back home to France, I instantly feel better. And apparently it's a super common thing for a lot of people in my comment section. So I want to understand what is really going on here. Of course, I'm not trying to generalize. This is not all the US or all of France. And I've had a few of my favorite meals in the US. Like very recently, Bobby's dad cooked us this delicious breakfast plate with homegrown tomatoes from his garden. And obviously, if you compare this delicious dish to this very sad pizza that you can find in a restaurant near the Eiffel Tower, you can understand that things vary a lot from place to place. And the first thing you need to know to understand this topic is how important food is in France. Like, we're the first country in time spent eating and drinking every day. Apparently, we spend 2 hours and 13 minutes a day eating or drinking, and we're closely followed by Spain and Italy, which tend to have similar eating habits to France. By the way, the US is towards the bottom at 1 hour and 2 minutes. So we spend more than double the time eating and drinking compared to the US. And France is also one of the countries where people cook the most at 8.6 meals cooked a week. So this means that we're not only spending time eating, but we're also spending time preparing the food. And by the way, this type of eating is very similar in a lot of other European countries, like Italy, for example, where I've lived for a bit. But since I'm trying to not overgeneralize, I'll specifically use French examples. And unfortunately, while France is the leader in time spent eating, the US is the leader in consumption of ultra-processed foods. And apparently those ultra-processed foods, they account for 60% of overall caloric intake in the US, while in Europe it's between 14 and 44%. So as you can see, in France, we in general eat less processed foods than in the US on a per calorie basis. But I also want to say that the processed foods we do eat actually tend to be better than in the US because they often don't contain harmful additives. And we'll talk about this later. Also, just know that I'm giving you a few stats so that you have an overall idea of how things are. But the US is a massive country with a lot of diversity. There's a lot of different people from different cultures who all eat differently. And you know, when food is such a big part of your life, you tend to have higher standards. In France, specifically, there's a lot of demand for the same fresh food. For example, in France, there's 32 million baguettes eaten daily for a population of 68 million. So obviously, if I go to a French bakery, things are gonna be pretty fresh. And in the US, people don't want as many baguettes as in France. When I buy a baguette in the US, even though it has been made perfectly, it's just not as fresh because it has been made a few days ago, so it's just not as good, which leads to this type of reviews on some French bakeries in the US. And by the way, it's just the same in France. If you keep a French baguette for a few days, it becomes hard as a rock. So everywhere where you have more demand for fresh food, you have access to fresher food. So for example, in NYC, the best thing to buy might not be baguettes, but bagels. Like, we went to this bagel shop and the lines were absolutely massive. And this is because they make all their bagels by hand from scratch in front of your eyes. Like, you can actually see them roll the dough and then put it in the oven. So obviously something that's fresh and hasn't been sitting on a shelf for days is way better, and those bagels were absolutely delicious. But there's more to the story, and I've read this Vox article called "Why Fruits and Vegetables Taste Better in Europe." It seems that we just have different standards for food in Europe. And as you'll see in the next section, I think that's just one part of the story. In this article, they say, we can just as easily grow food in the US that's as delicious as the food you eat in Europe. It's just that most of the time we choose not to. The growers are not paid for flavor, they are paid for yield. Basically, this means that for industrial farmers, the priority is profit, with bigger fruits and veggies that are more resistant and a lot of them. And this makes total sense, and it's also an issue in Europe where people have been complaining that tomatoes have no taste anymore in supermarkets since before I was born. But apparently, people here in Europe demand tasty veggies, and they are ready to pay for it. When in the US, people tend to prefer convenience. But as I was telling you before, I think that our individual choices are just a part of the issue because it's also easier to get fresh fruits and veggies in France, but we'll get to that in a bit. And I think we can re-see this idea of the consumers demanding more when we talk about seasonality. Like, the arrival of specific fruits and veggies is almost an event in some places in Europe. Like, for example, in France, every spring we have specific strawberries that people get very excited about. And of course, as I was telling you, we can find the tasteless tomato in France in any supermarket, but a lot more people tend to eat seasonal fruits and veggies because it's just tastier, cheaper, and it's everywhere in shops. And also another factor is that in France, we tend to eat more local food compared to the US. And again, I am not saying that French people only eat local food. I live in Paris, there are no farms around me, but each region in France has their local specialty that's really good, super famous, and that people love. Like, for example, I was born near Cahors, and I grew up next to a Rocamadour farm, which is this very soft goat cheese that you can find in the region. And as a family, we were eating that so much. When we moved to Toulouse around age 10, the way we ate kind of changed. We added more local products from that region in particular. And you can find the regional stuff from other regions in big cities like Paris. You could find the Rocamadour, but it's just not as good. It's not as fresh. But even in Paris and in other big cities, there's many ways you can have access to good kind of local food. Like, for example, all the food that you can see right now has been bought directly from a farmer that lives around 2 hours away from Paris. And this is actually cheaper than going to the supermarket, and it's way more delicious. Like, seriously, look at these little pumpkins. They look really delicious. And again, I'm not saying that this doesn't exist in the US. Like, for example, the breakfast plate I showed you before, Bobby's dad actually got the meat directly from a farm. What I'm saying is that in the US, it tends to be more expensive and less accessible, and I'll tell you all about that in a bit. And by the way, this is not limited to food. We also have higher standards in Europe when it comes to skincare, with the EU banning around 1,300 ingredients. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in this video, I feel I'm looking a little bit more glowy than usual. And it's because I'm wearing Typology's tinted skincare. Typology is a French skincare brand, and they're also the sponsor of today's video. I personally have incredibly high standards when it comes to skincare, and I have to say that I was blown away by the quality of their products. First, they use only the best and safest ingredients, which is a must for me because I only want to put good things on my skin. But I also love that their products not only give you that extra boost in the moment, but also treat your skin in the long run. Like, for example, I've been wearing their tinted concealer for the past 2 weeks, and not only I instantly look like I've had a good night's sleep, but it has also reduced the dark circles under my eyes thanks to its active ingredients. I'm also wearing their tinted lip oil, which is an absolute gem, and so subtle, which is just how I like it. They offer free shipping to the US for orders above $60, so it's the perfect occasion to try high-quality French skincare. Overall, I feel it's much easier to shop in France. Like, first of all the regional foods I was telling you about, they are strictly regulated. So even if you buy your Rocamadour in Paris, you know it's actually gonna be the real deal. And it's because we have official certifications that are literally regulated by law, so they're very official, that protects certain traditions and certain ways of making food. So for example, for a wine of Champagne, it's actually a region in France and it's protected. So there's a specific location, there's specific methods, specific grapes, and it's all highly regulated. So it's the case for most wines and other food products. So if you're drinking, let's say, a Pinot Noir wine, it's not the same taste if it's from Bourgogne or from Alsace. It's just two very different products. So it's not about the grapes, it's about the tradition and the region. And I don't want to get into too much details, but this labeling system is obviously not perfect, but it's a great way to find better and higher quality products. And in the US, I feel that it is way harder to make good decisions when you're shopping for food. The other day, I was eating a bagel from Trader Joe's, which is one of my absolute food shops in the US. Like, everyone who knows me in real life knows that one of the first things I do when I arrive to the US is go to Trader Joe's and check out everything they have. And I was eating this bagel and I was like, that's like so delicious. I wonder which spices they put on it. I looked at the ingredients and it was not spices, it was 11 grams of sugar per bagel. Like, that's almost like eating cake. There's no need to put so much sugar in a bagel, especially since I'm gonna eat 2 bagels for breakfast. Also, can we talk about how ridiculous the serving sizes are on the back of the pack? Like the recommended serving for the peanut butter I'm gonna eat with a bagel is 2 tablespoons. Obviously, I'm gonna put more than that, so it's really hard to understand how much sugar, how much stuff I'm actually eating. Just so you know, in Europe, we have all the nutrition facts presented by 100 grams. And this makes things way easier when you're trying to compare between products. And I feel that sometimes the food packaging in the US is just plain misleading. Like, if we look at this packaging of an unnamed brand, if I see the name mixed fruits, fruit snacks, fruit is our first ingredient, excellent source of vitamins, I personally think that I'm buying something that will look like fruit and will be pretty healthy, right? Well, the product actually looks like this, which to me is candy. You know, eating candy from time to time is absolutely fine, but this is not health food and this is not fresh fruits. And I've talked about it before, but I personally do get tricked by American food marketing all the time, especially when I first moved to the US. I really fell hard for it. I was eating all the sugar-free muffins, the healthy ice creams, and then I discovered that, this was not very good for me. And it's because there's so many random claims that you can make in the US. And one thing people recommend to avoid that is to obviously read the list of ingredients, but I feel it's just so complicated when there's so many of them. Let me show you what I eat when I eat processed foods, because I do eat processed foods sometimes. So, like a lot of people, when I don't have too much time, I like grabbing something quick, like a frozen food lunch. And in France, I go to a store that only sells frozen food that's called Picard. And a lot of people go to this shop. It's fairly affordable, and I bought a bowl of veggies and this gratin, which is potatoes with cheese, for a total of €4.20, which is around $4.5. And as you can see from the list of ingredients, what's in it is pretty straightforward. It's everything that I would expect from a gratin. But look at the list of ingredients on a similar dish in the US. I personally have no idea what most of these things are. And it's because most of these are actually hidden additives. Like recently we took an Amtrak train with Bobby from New York to San Francisco. In the train, Bobby gifted me a box of peanut butter chocolates, which were absolutely delicious. And then I looked at the ingredients. I'm not sure, but I think there's food dyes that are banned in the EU. I got a bit suspicious there, and I scanned the barcode with an app that tells you all the bad ingredients. And the results were pretty shocking, with really fun keywords like carcinogenic, hives, increased risk of disease. And here I don't want to get into too much detail because I could make a whole video on banned foods if you're into it. But basically the EU bans or restricts a lot of different additives that have been linked to cancer or other diseases. And the reason for that is called precautionary principle, which is a fancy word that just means that you have to prove that something is safe for humans to prove it in food if there's a risk that something could not be safe. And as a consumer, I'm really grateful this exists in the EU, because it's really hard to understand what E110 yellow 6 means on a label. And I don't think you should need to know what that is to not eat something that could potentially be carcinogenic. But this big debate on food quality is actually a broader issue. There's other things at play. And to explain why, I need to tell you about the concepts of food deserts. So food deserts are areas where people have limited access to affordable and healthy food. And when I first heard the concept of a food desert, I just couldn't understand it mentally, because I grew up in the opposite of a food desert, which apparently is called a food oasis. Growing up, fresh food was everywhere around me. Even when I went and visited my grandparents in the countryside, where the nearest big shop is a 30-minute drive away, people were growing vegetables, raising cattle, making fresh bread, so access to good food was really not an issue. So I really didn't understand what a food desert was until I took a road trip to Colorado. And I talked to people who lived in a very isolated town, and they told me that they had to drive an hour to have access to anything else that was not a gas station. And apparently in the US, around 19 million people live in food deserts, and a lot of these people are often lower income and maybe don't have the best access to transportation, which often leads to supermarkets leaving those areas. In France, things are a bit different. I've read this article by Le Monde, which is the main French newspaper, and they interview a person called Capucine Frouin, who is an urban planner, and she works on inequalities in the food supply in the Paris region. So she says, in France, there is no food desert, strictly speaking. The commercial network is tighter, and many towns continue the tradition of open-air markets, which allow you to buy fruits and vegetables at lower prices than in physical stores. But she also says later in the article that the poorest neighborhoods often have fewer stores selling fruits and vegetables. 40% of the food offering in these neighborhoods are fast foods. And that's what is called food swamps. Fruits and vegetables are there, they're accessible, but they are drawn by less healthy foods, in particular fast food. And I feel I can't remake this video without addressing how healthy food tends to be more expensive, how food insecurity tends to be a growing issue both in France and in the US. I've read this study from Utah State University, and it says that following the official USDA guidelines would cost a family of 4 between $12,000 and $14,000 a year. In comparison, the average middle-income family in the US spends around $6,000 a year on food, and low-income families almost $4,000. So as you can see, this is a pretty big gap, so it's normal that healthy eating feels out of reach for a lot of people. In France, things are less expensive. It's a bit less than $6,000 a year for the cheapest healthy products for a family of 4. And this might seem like it's way cheaper, but actually it's 36% of minimum wage, so it can be a lot. And if you prefer fancier organic products, it's almost the same as in the US. It's around $14,000 a year. And I want to read you a comment that stuck with me. And I feel this adds a new perspective on the other video I made on this topic. Knowing that you're going to eat at the same time every day, especially good food, I almost cried a little for my younger self. Even though I have access to good food now, I realized that I still eat in a way that reflects those times when food was scarce. And this video goes a bit deeper in the cultural aspects of eating healthy in France, and I think you should absolutely watch this one next because it will give you a full picture. Click here and go watch it. I'll see you there.